England's first colony descended into pure horror. In the winter of 1590, a privateering ship called the Hopewell cut through the gray chop of the Outer Banks, its rigging glazed with rime. The commander, John White, stood on the foredeck with a leaden weight in his stomach that had nothing to do with seasickness. He had been away 3 years. 3 years of war with Spain, of pleading with London merchants, of watching his granddaughter's christening gown grow small in his memory. Now, at last, the colony he had governed, his city of Raleigh, his 117 souls, waited somewhere beyond those low dunes. What he found would haunt England for a generation, not because of bloodshed alone, because of silence. The story of England's first permanent colony in the New World is not the story of Jamestown. That came later with its starving winters and tobacco fortunes. The true first, the 1587 settlement on Roanoke Island, lived in a stranger, worse register. It was a horror without a corpse, a mystery without a confession. And for the men, women, and children who lived through its final months, it was something far more intimate than a legend. It was the slow, ordinary collapse of everything that made them English. This is what happened when hope met hunger, when neighbor turned from neighbor, and when a forest that did not speak their language swallowed them whole. A garden of false calm. The morning they landed, July 22nd, 1587, the air smelled of myrtle and cedar. Virginia Dare's grandfather, John White, recorded it in his log as a place so full of grapes as the very beating and surge of the sea overflowed them. That detail matters. Grapes, wine, civilization. The 67 men, 20 women, and 9 children who staggered ashore saw not wilderness but a broken Eden waiting to be claimed. They were not the first Englishmen to set foot on Roanoke. That grim honor belonged to Sir Richard Grenville's 1585 expedition, which left behind a garrison of 15 men who were never seen again. Bones, perhaps. A rumor of massacre. But the 1587 colonists were different. They had women. They had children. They had a charter from Sir Walter Raleigh himself, a document that promised land, gentility, and a bulwark against Catholic Spain. They were not soldiers. They were builders. Thomas Harriot, the mathematician and naturalist who had traveled with the earlier voyage, had prepared them for wonders. He wrote of tobacco, of precious estimation among the natives. He described pearl fisheries and copper deposits. He assured London that the local people, the Secatan and the Croatoan, were gentle, loving, and faithful, void of all guile and treason. Harriot never set foot on Roanoke in 1587. He stayed in England, warm by the fire, writing optimistic pamphlets. The colonists did not know they were reading a travel brochure, the city that never was. They had meant to build their settlement on Chesapeake Bay, not Roanoke. But the Portuguese pilot, Simon Fernandez, commanding the flagship Lion, refused to carry them farther. He dumped them on Roanoke Island like a man shaking sand from his boot. Why? Historians still argue. Privateering schedules, impending storms, simple cruelty. Whatever the reason, the colonists found themselves on a narrow, swampy island ringed by salt marshes and dark loblolly pines, with no deep harbor and no English relief ships for months. They rebuilt the old Grenville Fort, a triangular palisade of sharpened logs, and inside it they raised crude cabins, 15 or 20 structures at most, a well, a storehouse, a small barracks. The entire settlement could have fit inside a single corner of a London parish, and yet they named it the City of Raleigh. The grandiosity was not delusion, it was strategy. A city on paper attracts investors. A city of wood and mud attracts only rain. By mid-August, the outline of a life emerged. Men fished the Sound for drum and sheep's head. Women tended garden plots hacked from the sandy soil. Children chased fiddler crabs across the tidal flats. And on August 18th, 1587, Eleanor Dare, daughter of the governor, gave birth to a female child, Virginia Dare, the first English person born in the Americas. John White painted her, I think. He was a watercolorist of real skill. His images of Carolina Algonquians are still studied today. There must have been a sketch, now lost, of a squalling infant wrapped in linen, her mother exhausted on a pallet of dried rushes. In that moment, the colony felt immortal. How could God destroy a place that had produced a firstborn, the first cut? The trouble began quietly, like rot under bark. 3 days after Virginia's baptism, a colonist named George Howe went crabbing alone along the northern shore. He had been warned. The local Roanoke tribe, still nursing a grudge from Grenville's 1585 raids, when English soldiers had burned their town and beheaded their chief, watched every English movement from the mainland. But Howe was a lutenist and a gentleman. He had survived the earlier expedition. He believed, perhaps sincerely, that music and good manners could bridge any gap. They found his body at low tide. Arrows through the chest and thighs, skull crushed. The crabs they had meant to trap were picking at his fingers. Governor White led a night march to the mainland village of Dassamongapuk, convinced the Roanoke warriors had sheltered there. The English walked through moonlit cornfields, muskets primed. They found the village empty. But in the darkness, someone shouted. Muskets fired. When dawn came, they discovered they had shot their own guide, a friendly CROATOAN man who had offered to negotiate. No Roanoke enemy was killed. No justice was done. Only a helpful ally, bleeding in the grass, asking in broken English why they had hurt him. That was August 29th, 1587. It was the first and last military action the colony would ever conduct. From that night forward, the island felt watched. Corners of the forest seemed to breathe. Fires on the mainland flickered after midnight. The Secatan who had traded venison and maize for copper trinkets stopped coming. The palisade gates, once left open for commerce, were shut and barred at dusk. The governor's terrible choice. By early September, the colonists faced a hard arithmetic. Their food was running out. A cask of salt beef had spoiled. The maize they had traded for in July was half gone. And their governor, John White, was consumed by a problem. The colonists wanted him to sail back to England for supplies, but he was the only man with authority to govern. They demanded it. Women begged him. Men threatened mutiny. Go, fetch us more food, more tools, more soldiers, and bring back Virginia's christening gift, a proper silver cup, not this carved gourd. White refused. Then he relented. Then he refused again. The logbook records a desperate meeting inside the palisade, probably in the storehouse, the air thick with smoke from green pine and the smell of fear. Finally, White agreed to leave on condition that if the colony were forced to abandon the island, they would carve a message on a tree. A Maltese cross if danger was immediate. No cross if they had simply moved. They promised. They swore it. On August 27th, 1587, Just 5 weeks after landing, John White sailed away in a small pinnace. He left behind his daughter, his newborn granddaughter, his son-in-law Ananias Dare, and 113 other English souls. He believed he would return in 6 months. He did not return for 3 years, a diary of absences. We do not know what happened inside the Roanoke palisade between September 1587 and the spring of 1588. No English record survives. The colonists did not keep a journal, or if they did, it rotted in a marshy grave. But we can reconstruct the shape of their horror from what later found. Soil samples, tree rings, stray artifacts, and the single most chilling document in early American history, John White's own 1590 account of what he did not find. Start with the people, 117 individuals. Of them, we know only 12 names with certainty. The others are ghosts within a ghost story, a bricklayer, a tailor, a gentleman's servant, a child called Little John, 3 women whose husbands had died on the voyage. They came from London, from Norwich, from the West Country. They spoke English. They prayed to the same God. They shared a common memory of thatched roofs and market bells and the sulphurous smell of the Thames at low tide. All of that was now 3,000 miles away, across an ocean that took 2 months to cross in good weather. And the weather was not good. The winter of 1587 to 1588 was brutal. Tree ring data from the region shows that it was one of the coldest in the 16th century. The sound froze in places. The palisades' mud chinking cracked and fell out. Sickness came. The well, dug too shallow, turned brackish. By December, the settlers were eating their dogs. By January, they were boiling leather, the whisper network. In a settlement so small, privacy was a myth. Every cough carried. Every glance between a man and a woman who were not married was noted. Every spoonful of gruel was weighed against the one you gave your neighbor. Tensions began to calcify along old lines. The gentlemen, men like the bricklayer's son who had bought a fine doublet for the voyage, looked down on the laborers. The Londoners distrusted the country folk. And everyone, I think, began to suspect everyone else of hoarding. There is a phenomenon in extreme survival situations called the breakdown of reciprocal altruism. In plain English, when hunger lasts long enough, you stop sharing. You start watching. You notice that George's wife looks plumper than your wife. You notice that the tailor's son goes into the woods alone and comes back with his pockets bulging. You tell yourself he must have found a cache of acorns. You tell yourself he has not shared them. The first fight was over a stolen turnip. The second was over a rumor, unconfirmed, that a fishing party had caught a sturgeon and eaten it before returning to the fort. By February, 2 men had been placed in irons. The charges? Theft of firewood? No trial records exist. But the irons themselves have been found. A pair of rusted leg shackles excavated in the 1990s from a collapsed cellar on Roanoke. They were English-made, stamped with the London foundry mark. They were also too small for a man's ankle. They were child-sized. Strangers in a familiar land. The Algonquian-speaking people of the Outer Banks watched the English fort like men watching a slow fire. They had reason to hate the newcomers. Grenville's 1585 soldiers had stolen corn, burned villages, killed a man for taking a silver cup from a stolen boat. And now these new English had shot their CROATOAN ally in the dark. But hatred is never simple. Some native people, perhaps the CROATOAN who lived on Hatteras Island to the south, still offered help. Archaeology suggests that sometime in late winter or early spring of 1588, the colonists began to move. They did not flee en masse. Instead, they made a choice that has confused historians for centuries. They dismantled the palisade. They filled the well with debris, broken pots, charred beams, a child's shoe. They buried some items reverently, a rapier, a writing desk, an astrolabe, and abandoned others mid-use, a cooking pot with dried corn still inside. This was not a panicked flight. This was a decision. The most likely explanation is the most chilling one. They did not leave because they were starving. They left because they had chosen to live with the native people, not as prisoners, not as conquerors, as something in between. Think about what that means. 117 English men, women, and children raised on sermons about savage cannibals, trained to see the New World as a howling wilderness, decided that their best chance of survival was to become, in some sense, not English anymore. They scattered. Some went south to CROATOAN. Some went west to the mainland. Some, perhaps, tried to reach the Chesapeake. And in doing so, they entered a world where every English habit, their clothing, their names, their God, their notion that one man could own land began to dissolve. The things they buried. The artifacts left behind on Roanoke tell a story of slow erosion. A fire-starting kit made from a flintlock pistol, the gun converted to an Indian tool. A copper farthing carefully pierced for use as a necklace. A sewing needle stuck into a deer bone, as if someone meant to return for it and never did. No cross was carved into any tree. No message warned of immediate danger. John White would find only one word, carved into a post of the palisade. CROATOAN, and on a nearby tree, the letters CRO, as if the carver had been interrupted. No cross, no cross. To White, that meant the colony had moved, not died. He believed until his own death that he would find them alive, living among the CROATOAN people. He never did, but he also never stopped looking. What he did not know, could not know, was that the horror had not been a single event. It had been a process, a slow, quiet, utterly English tragedy, a geography of disappearance. The people who left Roanoke did not vanish all at once. They melted. Over the next 20 years, scattered reports drifted back to Jamestown and then to London. A yellow-haired woman seen among the Tuscarora weaving English-style cloth. A man with a European face who served as a Powhatan war captain. 2 children living with a medicine man on the Chowan River, speaking Algonquian but calling each other Tom and Bess. In 1607, when John Smith, explored the Chesapeake, he was told by Chief Powhatan himself that he had been at the slaughter of those people, the Roanoke colonists, and showed him English-made muskets as proof. But Smith also heard other stories. A tribe called the Chesapeacian had allegedly been wiped out for harboring the English. A man named Jack was seen building a wooden house, in the mainland style, with a brick chimney. Impossible technology for a native craftsman. One report from 1609 is particularly haunting. A Jamestown colonist named Francis Nelson spoke with a tribe on the James River who showed him 2 English boys, very well favored, who had been bred among them. The boys could not speak English. They did not remember their names. They wore deerskin and shell beads and played a local game involving a netted hoop. When asked where they came from, one boy pointed south toward Roanoke. Then he shrugged. The CROATOAN riddle. When John White finally stepped ashore on August 18, 1590, 3 years to the day after Virginia Dare's birth, he did not find a massacre. He found an absence so complete it felt like a rebuke. The palisade was gone. Not burned, not torn down with violence, but dismantled. The logs had been carefully stacked nearby, as if for future use. The cabins had collapsed inward, but not from fire, from weather and neglect. Weeds grew through the thresholds. A human skull, cleaned of flesh and bleached white, rested on a post near the gate. White identified it in his journal as the head of one of the colony's enemies, likely a native trophy. He did not say how he knew. The word CROATOAN was carved into a gatepost in perfect Roman letters. No cross, no sign of struggle, no bodies. White wanted to search for them. He had a boat, 40 sailors, and a desperate hope. But a hurricane was building off Cape Hatteras. His crew refused to stay. They dragged him back to the Hopewell as the sky turned green and the sea began to boil. He stood at the stern, watching the low-gray smudge of Roanoke shrink, and he knew, with the particular agony of a father and grandfather, that he would never see his family again. He was right. The lost families. What happened to the 117? The answer is not a single story, but a constellation of small horrors, each one a variation on a theme. They tried to live, and then they could not live as English people. Let us follow 3 threads, the Hatteras group. Perhaps 40 colonists went south to CROATOAN Island, modern Hatteras. The CROATOAN people were friendly. They had traded with the English for years. Intermarriage was possible. Children were born. English surnames, Dare, Manteo, Harvey, blended with Algonquian naming customs. For a generation, a small hybrid community existed. Then disease came, then conflict with other tribes. By 1650, no one on Hatteras spoke English, but they remembered. Some of our grandmothers had pale skin and yellow hair. They told stories about a great ship with white wings, the mainland seepage. A smaller group, perhaps 15 to 20 people, moved west to the Chowan River region. They did not assimilate smoothly. These were the survivors of the winter hunger, men who had stolen, women who had watched their children starve. They brought their English bitterness with them. A 1608 report from Jamestown describes certain men clothed in deer skins who spoke a corrupt English and would not come near our fort for fear of being hanged. They had been living with the Chowanoke tribe, but as outcasts, not as family. One of them, a man called Newport's servant, in the records, allegedly killed a Chowanoke child in a dispute over a fishing net. The tribe expelled them. They wandered into the Great Dismal Swamp. No one ever saw them again. The Chesapeake Gambit. The original plan, remember, was to settle on Chesapeake Bay. Some colonists, perhaps a dozen, led by Ananias Dare, Virginia's father, tried to reach it in a small boat they built from the dismantled palisade. They sailed north in the spring of 1588. They never arrived. Jamestown settlers later found a wrecked shallop on the York River, its timbers split, an English axe lodged in the keel. Nearby, a skeleton with a rusted wedding ring still on its finger. The ring was engraved ED to AD 1587. Eleanor Dare to Ananias Dare. No other trace. The silence after the word. By 1595, John White was an old man in Ireland, writing letters to anyone who would listen. He believed the colonists were alive. He believed they were waiting for him. He drew maps with tiny English flags, planted on imaginary forts. He died in 1598, probably in County Cork, probably still believing. He never learned what the colony's true horror had been. It was not the starvation. It was not the arrows. It was this. The children forgot. Imagine a girl born on Roanoke in the spring of 1588, after the worst of the hunger had passed. Her mother was English. Her father was CROATOAN. She grew up speaking 2 languages, but English faded first, because who was there to speak it with? Her mother died of a fever when the girl was 6. The grandmother, Eleanor Dare, died 2 winters later. By the time the girl was 10, she had no one left who remembered London. No one who could explain why her skin was lighter than her cousin's. No one who could tell her that she was, by any English law, a citizen of a country she would never see. She married a CROATOAN man. She bore children. She ground corn. She lived a life of ordinary labor and ordinary love. And she never, not once, carved an English letter into a tree. That is the horror. Not a scream, a silence. What the forest kept for 300 years, Roanoke was a ghost story told around American fires. Then in 1937, a stone was found near the Chowan River. It was the size of a small Bible, gray and smooth, carved with a cross and a message. Ananias Dare and Virginia went hence unto heaven 1591. Father John White, go home. Eleanor Dare. The Dare stone caused a sensation. Then it was exposed as a forgery, carved by a local stonemason to sell to tourists. The embarrassment was so complete that serious archaeologists avoided Roanoke for another 50 years. But the forest does not lie. Modern excavations have found English artifacts scattered across 100 miles of North Carolina coastline. A rapier hilt in a native burial mound, a writing slate on Hatteras, a child's lead whistle near Edenton. None of these objects were found with signs of violence. None were hidden in caves or mass graves. They were simply there, absorbed into the soil like leaves. The most telling find came in 1998. On Roanoke itself, beneath a layer of shell middens and charcoal, archaeologists uncovered a small piece of a woman's shoe. Not a moccasin. A real English shoe, size 5, with brass eyelets and a leather sole stitched in a London pattern. The leather was worn thin on the left side. The owner had dragged her foot when she walked. Near the shoe, a handful of seeds, not corn or beans, but English barley. Someone had tried to farm English grain on Roanoke, and then at some point, she had walked away and never come back for her shoe. The Jamestown Confession. In 1611, a Jamestown colonist named William Strachey interviewed an old Powhatan man called Macumps. Macumps had traveled to England, seen London, shaken the hand of a king. He was not a savage by any English measure. He was an interpreter. Strachey asked him about the Roanoke colonists. Macumps hesitated. Then he said this: "At the fall of the leaf, 7 years after the English left their fort, a priest of the Wahansunakak called upon the people to kill the strangers living among them. They had angered the spirits," he said. "They had brought disease. They had taught the women to read marks on paper, which is a kind of witchcraft. And so my father's people killed them, not all at once, some by the river, some in their sleep. One woman they kept alive for 2 years because she could weave English cloth. Then she too." Strachey recorded the conversation in a letter. He did not publish it. The letter was found in 1849, tucked inside a copy of Purchas His Pilgrims in the Bodleian Library at Oxford. The woman who could weave English cloth Her name is not recorded. But the cloth itself has survived. A scrap of twill, woven in an English pattern, found in a cave on the Pamlico River in 1965. Carbon dating places it between 1585 and 1600. The wool came from an English sheep. The dye came from a native plant, yellow root. She had tried to make something beautiful, and then she was gone. What happened to England's first colony? There is no single answer. There are only probabilities, shifting like sand on the outer banks. The most likely truth is this: the colonists did not all die at once. They scattered. Some were killed by native people who'd been wronged by English violence. Some died of disease, of hunger, of exposure. Some assimilated so completely that their Englishness faded within a generation. And a very few, perhaps a dozen, survived long enough to see John White's search party from the forest, recognize the English flags, and chose not to come forward. They had become something else, something the forest had made. There is a word for this in Algonquian. Witamin, it means, I have forgotten what I used to know. Not a loss, a transformation. The Roanoke colonists did not vanish. They were translated. Their children's children's children still live on the Carolina coast today, though they do not call themselves English. They call themselves Lumbee. They call themselves Haliwasaponi. They call themselves simply the people. And some of them, when asked about the old stories, will point to a sandy island in the Sound and say, our grandmothers came from there. She had yellow hair. She told us never to trust men who come in big ships. The house that waits. Let me tell you one more thing. In 2012, a drought exposed the remains of a small structure on the mainland, across from Roanoke. It was not an Indian longhouse or a wigwam. It was an English-style cottage. Post-in-ground construction, a central hearth, a secondary room that might have been a parlor. The timbers had been cut with English axes. The nails were English-made. But the roof had been thatched with marsh grass, Algonquian style. The hearth contained a mixture of English pottery and native shell-tempered ware, and buried beneath the floor, wrapped in a piece of deerskin, was a small wooden doll. It had a carved face, European features, and one arm missing. The other arm was sewn on with sinew. Beside the doll, a single copper farthing. Date 1586. The house was never completed. The walls stood only 3 feet high. The roof was half finished. Someone had stopped working in the middle of an ordinary day and walked away, carrying a child with a broken doll, and never came back. The forest grew over it. The marsh reclaimed the hearth. For 400 years, the house waited. We do not know why they left. We do not know if they meant to return. If you visit the site today, and you can, though it is marked only by a small plaque and a fence to keep out looters, you will notice something strange. The ground is level. The trees are mature. There is no sign of violence, no ash layer, no mass grave. But if you stand very still, and the wind is right, and you listen past the sound of the waves on the Sound, you can almost hear it. A child crying. A woman shushing her. The tap of a wooden doll against a floor that no longer exists. England's first colony did not descend into pure horror all at once. It seeped into it like water into sand. It forgot itself, and in forgetting, it became something the empire could never claim. A story that belongs only to the land that swallowed it. John White's granddaughter, Virginia Dare, is still out there, not as a ghost, as an absence, the most perfect, most English of horrors. The certainty that someone you loved once stood where you are standing, and you will never know what happened to her. CROATOAN, no cross. Goodbye.